Do I just start? Okay. Welcome, excuse me. Welcome to the Association of the Bar of the City of New York. I'm Laura Gilbert, the chair of the association's Project on the Homeless, which is co-sponsoring this event with the Committee on Municipal Affairs and the Books at the Bar Committee. I'm delighted that Howard Schrader, who is in charge of this breakfast series, has invited me to introduce John Giler and his book, Sleeping with the Mayor. Sleeping with the Mayor, excuse me, is the story of the homeless encampment in City Hall Park during New York City's budget negotiations in the summer of 1988. The book has been praised for many reasons, for its portrayal of the complexity of the homeless population and its many problems and dramas, for its depiction of New York City and its political and social figures, and for its portrait of the fascinating and enigmatic Ed Koch and its gutsy view of racism. Before turning the program over to John, I'd like to say just a couple of words about what makes this book noteworthy in another way. It's a wonderful piece of writing. In its compassion for difficult personalities and points of view, it's like The Amazing Common Ground by J. Anthony Lucas. And in its sense of the absurd and the tangle of values and the marvel that are New York City, it's very like Bonfire of the Vanities. Finally, John Giler. He describes himself as the only son of an Irish mother and a Jewish father, a flunk out from the University of Pennsylvania who tramped around Europe, exploring his Irish-Jewish roots, tending bar in Ireland, and digging ditches on a kibbutz in Israel. John's also a journalist and an actor and the award-winning playwright of Avenue X. This is his second book. At the end of his talk, he'll be taking questions, and his books will be available for purchase. He's generously agreed to contribute the proceeds of the sales to the association's legal clinic for the homeless.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for having me. Good morning. You know, as Laura said, I used to be an actor, and in fact, my very first professional job was doing classical plays in New York City public high schools. And so I used to think that standing in the wings of Brooklyn Tech in a powdered wig, getting ready to go on in a Molière play at 9 a.m. was my toughest gig ever. This morning, facing a battery of lawyers at 8:45 is equally daunting. However, I'm really sort of thrilled to be here. Actually, this satisfies a lifetime of curiosity, just standing in this building, because I grew up in New York, and when I was a little urchin with imagination, my friends and I would gravitate towards 44th Street, because to us it was really kind of an arcade of mystery. There was the Algonquin over here, which we would peer into and imagine Dorothy Parker and Robert Benchley taking off their clothes and dancing on tabletops and wisecracking and drinking until dawn, and we would look at the New York Yacht Club over here with its prow hanging over 44th Street, and we would imagine overbred nincompoops in blue blazers calling each other Commodore. But then we would peer in here, and we couldn't imagine what the hell you were doing in here. I mean, we could see that it was vaguely marble and sort of classical. I guess we imagined that you were lounging around in black judicial robes, saying very even-handed, fair things to each other. Right? But actually, that may be the fantasy that contains the most truth, because when I finally became 18, of drinking age, a friend of mine and I went to the Algonquin. We sat in a couple of overstuffed armchairs, ordered a couple of Manhattans, and waited for the repartee to flow. But we couldn't think of anything to say. So we sat in complete silence for an hour and went home with terrible hangovers. But the next time I encountered the Bar Association was some years ago when I began the research for Sleeping with the Mayor, which really has been almost 10 years in the gestation. I was looking for kind of an overview of this incredibly agonized, complicated problem, an overview that was not as emotional and polemic as a lot of the things that the advocates put out, or as full of impenetrable jargon as the HPD manuals. And I came across something called the New York City Association of the Bar, a report on the homeless, circa 1988, and it was by far the most clear-eyed document on that or any civic problem that I've ever read. So for that reason, too, I'm delighted to be here. And to that end, as Laura said, when we sell these autographed copies at the end of my talk, the proceeds will all go to the City Bar Fund, and it's a legal fund for the homeless. So if you like what you hear, buy a book. Even if you don't like what you hear, find another way to support them, because they do extraordinary work. On to Sleeping with the Mayor. I live about a block from City Hall Park, and one morning, several years ago, I ambled into the park with my morning coffee, which is my custom. And to my great surprise, there were 30 people asleep on the lawn who had not been there the night before. They had sprung up quite literally like mushrooms. So I began snooping around, which is also my custom, and I discovered that they had been rounded up for an overnight candlelight vigil to protest homelessness. But now that morning had come, the various priests and rabbis who rounded them up had gone home. But the homeless, having no home and sort of preferring this leafy paradise to the floor of Penn Station or wherever they had been rounded up from, remained. And they had no intention of leaving. Now I found this tale amusing, titillating, but also a little frightening, because I knew that when Mayor Ed Koch got to work the next day, this was the very first thing that he would see. And because he is one of my protagonists, I would like to begin by reading to you a little snatch about him. Oops. Sorry. In the Blue Room of City Hall, Ed Koch was consuming a cup of coffee, his third of the morning, though the hour had not yet struck 10. The whole month would be like this. State law required that the budget be in place by the 1st of July, so that meant that all the haggling, the compromises, the bitching, the kvetching, the accusations, all of it had to be compressed into 30 days. That meant coffee. It also meant a carnival sideshow. Ed Koch's immediate goal was to reach the graceful curved staircase that led to the second floor. From this, he was separated by only 20 feet of distance, but also by 100 lobbyists, all of them with frenzied, heart-rending agendas, some of them in costume. To his left were 6 fat women in fire hats, protesting the closing of a firehouse in Brooklyn. Directly ahead of him were a trio of extremely angry women, all with photographs of dead babies, protesting the lack of prenatal care for the poor. The ACT UP people, demanding money for AIDS, could always be counted on for theatricality. This year, they had brought in a gaunt, lesion-studded young man on a litter. Swathed in a black caftan, he reminded the mayor of a photograph he'd once seen of Sarah Bernhardt playing Medea. By the time he finally reached the staircase, Ed Koch had been branded a murderer a half a dozen times by almost as many organizations. His unspoken reaction, even as he took it all in with a pained, sympathetic look, was screw all of you. This was not necessarily cruel, far from it. As the mother pig, you have only so many nipples, and there are countless gaping open mouths. Oh, you could say yes to everyone, of course, and everyone would love you for a few days until the city went broke and everything went down the toilet. Ed Koch considered his greatest political talent the ability to say no. He'd balanced 10 consecutive budgets and was about to balance his 11th, dead babies notwithstanding. That was what he got paid for, what he was famous for, and what had saved New York. And in fact, when Ed Koch first took office, as I'm sure a lot of you remember, New York was in the worst physical crisis of its history. Businesses leaving in droves for places like the Sun Belt, the banks unwilling to lend us money. The feeling was sort of that the whole place would soon become like Detroit, you know, where people would work in the daytime and kind of abandon after dark to packs of roaming hairless dogs. But Ed Koch put a stop to all that and restored not only our economy, but to all appearances, our civic pride. And as he headed into what appeared to be an inevitable fourth term, he truly had an air of invincibility about him, until roughly around the time of the events of this book. Sure enough, the day after I discovered the homeless encampment in the park, so did Ed Koch. And he immediately tried to get rid of them by wiping them out with a fleet of sanitation trucks. But it backfired on him rather badly, because the City Hall press corps, bored to numbness, as they frequently are, covered it. And Kochville, as they dubbed it, made the 11 o'clock news, all of which enraged the mayor even further, especially when during the ensuing week they began wandering into City Hall every day. So as we rejoin the story, the little community of Kochville is tremblingly waiting for the final brutal axe to fall on them. Just as the last light was dying, a small, squat man emerged from City Hall and strode towards the settlement. This figured to be a city official with a white flag proposal. Go peaceably and spare us the unpleasantness of obliterating you. Mark Greenberg, one of the leaders of the group, girded himself for the confrontation. All day he had struggled anew with the bowel-twisting question: resist and defy, putting everyone at risk, or give up gracefully and savor the small prizes already won. Now the official was almost upon the camp, and Greenberg recognized the face. He was not one of the Koch deputy mayors, nor was he a higher-up in the Parks Department. It was Norman Siegel, the head of the New York Civil Liberties Union. I see a glimmer of recognition on the face of some counselors. No greater happiness could have been felt by the people inside the Alamo had Sam Houston ever shown up. Norman Siegel. He seemed to appear at the most hopeless times to defend the most hapless people. A middle-aged Jew from Brooklyn, Siegel had worked in the Southern Civil Rights Movement alongside Ed Koch. But that was where the resumes diverged. Siegel had never taken that inexplicable turn to the right, nor had he stabilized into an easy liberal complacency. Instead, middle age had only deepened his rage. He was a potent combination: a sharp legal mind, a knuckle-breaking persistence, and an uncanny knack for television coverage. This time, Siegel felt, he had ferreted out something very big indeed. He'd seen the original story in the 11 o'clock news, and shortly afterward paid a visit to Parks Commissioner Henry Stern. As all of Kochville craned an ear, Siegel described the meeting. Hello, Henry. Hello, Norman. I wanted to talk to you about the people in the park. I know all about them, Norman. I was down there yesterday. Well, what did you tell them? Well, what do you think I told them? I told them they couldn't live in the park. It's against the law. Well, they're not living there. They're holding a political demonstration. Oh, really? Well, what about those huge bags of junk they haul around with them? Aren't bags allowed? Oh, come on, Norman. No, really, what about the sandwiches the office workers eat at lunchtime? Aren't they in bags? I'm talking about big bags, said Henry Stern with some exasperation. But there are little sandwiches and big sandwiches. Would someone with a hero sandwich be barred from the park? Stop it, Norman. I don't want to get into this game with you. I'm talking about foul-smelling vagrants carrying huge shopping bags. So shopping bags are illegal? In each hand with all their earthly belongings in them? Yes. Oh, so one hand must be free? A woman crossing Central Park with 2 shopping bags from Bloomingdale's is in violation of the law? All right, stop it. Muzzle that bulldog. Stern could feel the teeth locked around his ankle. Siegel was going to take this as far as it would go. If it got into court, the case could drag on for months and kick up a disastrous dust storm of publicity. The wiser choice might be to let these derelicts stay where they were until the budget hearings were over. At least they'd be more or less invisible in all the other hubbub around City Hall, and afterwards there could be no possible justification for calling them lobbyists. Until July 1st, Norman, period. My word of honor, said Norman Siegel. The story astonished Kochville. A meeting between white men had actually been resolved in their favor. And the larger reality was truly unbelievable. July 1st, that was like a date on a lease, for God's sakes, like a house with a roof. And it was 3 weeks away, 3 solid, succulent, leisurely, summery weeks. Siegel prepared to leave, wishing the men luck and accepting all sorts of slovenly, profuse thanks. That's all right, guys, glad to do it. Who should I contact if I need to? No one spoke. I mean, who's in charge? Said Siegel. The question hung in the air, and Siegel finally realized it wasn't going to be answered. Just call me if you need me, he said, and with that he was gone, another notch in his attaché case. For a long time, no one moved. Then heads slowly began to raise and turn toward the direction of a shadow under a giant elm. First one face, then a couple more, then a group of 5, like compass points swinging around to the north. Finally, every face was looking at Larry Locke. The reclusive, half-Indian, half-black man was sitting under the tree that had become his home, and until now, he had more or less ignored the melodrama as if his thoughts were on some higher plane. As he began to understand what was being asked of him, he surveyed the men with hooded, tired eyes. Why me? He seemed to be asking them. And indeed, there were more likely candidates for leadership than the reticent, almost sullen Locke. But there was something about him that demanded attention. He drew you into him. You believed him. You wanted to follow him places. Though there were 30 pairs of eyes on him, Larry Locke resisted the pressure and thought slowly. He'd been taught by Winston Locke, his father, always to take whatever time he needed. And now, with the offer of leadership in front of him, he closed his eyes and addressed it as his father would have sized up a farm chore. Large task or small, you always did what you could. That was your duty, particularly to yourself. And so Larry Locke wrestled on the cloak of leadership to see if it fit. In his mind's eye, he saw the panel of the Board of Estimate behind a horseshoe-shaped desk in front of a few dozen spectators' benches. This had never seemed right to Larry Locke. The board members sat whispering and chuckling to themselves at a great distance from the people they were supposed to be serving. This morning, to avoid a particularly intense early shower, everyone had sat in on a meeting of the city council. In the council chambers, the gallery was a horseshoe on a mezzanine floor, and all the council members were down below, as if in a pit. What Larry liked about it, though, were the procedures. If members had something to say, they stood up at their desks and talked. They could talk to the head man at the front, they could pivot and talk to another council member, they could even look up and address the gallery. Larry was struck with the goodwill of it all. The person who was standing was allowed to finish. Sometimes someone would try to hoot him or her down, and then the head man would intervene and protect the rights of the speaker. You could say your piece, and when you were finished, you sat. That struck Larry Locke as pretty sound. Let's pull these around, he said suddenly, indicating the green park benches. And with these words, Larry Locke accepted the mantle of leadership. The men began to wrestle with the benches, some of which had been chained together just to prevent them from being moved. Eventually, a half dozen were manipulated into a circle. Larry Locke walked into the middle of it. Everyone sit, please, he said, and everyone did so. I never did this before. Can't hear you, said a voice. Larry Locke turned to the voice and repeated himself, but now the people behind him couldn't hear. So, this was the first problem. In a circle, especially outdoors, you had to keep rotating to take everyone in. And you had to be loud. But after a couple of more sentences, that felt fine to Larry Locke, because to say something loud, you had to mean it, and that was the point. I never did this kind of thing before, but I think we should do it like this. Anybody that's got something to say, stand up, say it. These last couple of words seemed to hang in the air long after they were spoken. was a while before his thoughts churned out another sentence. Larry Locke, as it turned out, was not a man of words. But by the time he sat down, people felt as if the first rule of Kochville had been drawn up. Anyone who had anything to say stood up and said it. There was nothing more to it. It wasn't necessarily simple, however. The next man who stood to talk was Little Al, who requested that people stow their gear by the railing where it would be easier to keep an eye on. To this, someone immediately objected, suggesting that the concrete area by the benches was less muddy. But Al had been interrupted, which was not allowed. All eyes turned to Larry Locke for a ruling. "Let the man speak," said Larry, and so Little Al finished his remarks before the man with the opposite point of view was allowed to rise. Then a gangling, light-skinned man rose and identified himself as Mr. Cooper. Not long after he began, it became clear to everyone that he was not in his right mind and that the issue Mr. Cooper was addressing was unique to him. He was complaining about the array of multicolored laser lights being shot through his brain by the federal government. All eyes swiveled to Larry Locke. Larry struggled for a moment with the extenuating circumstances, but decided that the basic principle was important to uphold. "Let the man speak," he said. And speak he did. Mr. Cooper touched for a while on the subject of microbes from the planet Venus. He spoke of giant sexual organs steaming and hissing poisonous gases. At one point, Mr. Cooper said the word purple 100 times in rapid succession, and shortly afterwards repeated the word flagellation roughly the same number of times. By the time he was winding down about an hour later, Mr. Cooper was drenched with sweat. Upon concluding, he took off into the night on the dead run. After a considerable silence, Larry Locke rose. "I think we ought to call it a night," he said. And the group split off into various small clusters, unrolling their blankets and considering the problems of democracy. And indeed, shortly after this incident, the little government veered the opposite way towards complete tyranny, and then for a while nobody was allowed to say anything. And thus, democracy struggled to define itself. And it was at this point that I became, I fancied that the Athenians and Jefferson must have wrestled with the same issues. And I became totally obsessed and took the rather extreme step of subletting my apartment and moving into the park with these people. To the horror of my then girlfriend, now wife. She's forgiven me, obviously. Nor was I the only journalist entranced with them, although none of them took the extreme step that I did. But at this point, Kochville became famous. For a season, for an instant, among the most sought-after celebrities in liberal New York. Suddenly in great demand at dinner parties, talk shows, cocktail parties, and even in some cases, boudoirs of uptown liberal Manhattan. And the next little snatch I'd like to read to you is about the leader of the homeless group, Larry Locke, whom we've already met, taking his first trembling step into high society. Larry Locke had often stared up at the columned, gilded municipal building while lying on his back in City Hall Park. He'd already roamed its corridors by day, but nothing prepared him for the night. He stepped into an elevator with several lilac-smelling women in cocktail dresses and rode to the top. The doors opened to reveal the Art Nouveau offices of Borough President Dinkins, illuminated only by candlelight. Dinkins himself, in a double-breasted suit, was receiving his guests. Larry was almost embarrassed by the effusiveness of his own greeting. He'd met the man only once, briefly, in the park. But the borough president put him immediately at ease. He had a graceful way about him and great sad eyes. And he seemed to be in his element. A three-piece combo was playing Duke Ellington's Satin Doll, a sweet gurgling piano, a lazy bass, a simple brushing of the drums. The chatter was muted but constant and almost sexual, more sounds than words, ahs, and ooze. To merely exist at this gathering required a shifting of gears, a suspension of all anxiety, an easiness. This was hard for Larry to achieve. He was afraid he smelled and was frightened of getting too near anyone. The room was half full of black people, but even this did not relax him because they were the most elegantly dressed, sweetest smelling ones of all. One woman looked like Josephine Baker, even to the detail of a feather in her hair. A young white woman in a tuxedo approached him and asked him if he wanted a drink. Larry soon realized that she was a waitress. He asked her for a glass of gin with some ice, but she didn't understand the order. A gin and tonic? A martini on the rocks? Just fill up a glass with gin and drop some ice into it, he repeated. But she continued to look at him quizzically, and now he felt as if half the room was staring at him, even though he'd done nothing more than order the standard libation of Fayetteville, North Carolina. Finally, mercifully, the woman disappeared and came back with the drink, and he gulped about half of it, and very soon felt better, as he knew he would. "Larry!" crackled a voice behind him. He braced himself. It was Amy Goodman. He didn't care for the woman personally, but knew that she controlled several $1 million worth of foundation grants. For that kind of money, he would be, for a few minutes, the Nubian slave giving Cleopatra a milk bath. "Miss Goodman, do you believe what that bastard did to us?" Larry searched the day for the particular bastard and the particular offense. "I think he should be executed," continued Amy Goodman. "I'm quite serious. As long as people are yakking about the death penalty, and he's one of them, for Christ's sake, what about him? 100,000 people are homeless. He wants to keep the goddamn buildings empty?" Now Larry was clued in. Warehousing was the issue, and Peter Vallone was the bastard. Vallone, who was the city council president, was sticking up for his constituents, many of whom were small-scale Queens landlords who wanted to retain the right to move their apartments on and off the market for strategic reasons. The practice was called warehousing, and in the era of homelessness, there was something grossly callous and possibly criminal about it, like hoarding food during wartime. Larry got Amy Goodman's point, but not the moral indignation she brought to it. In fact, it made him uncomfortable, particularly when she started calling people bastards. Larry had always been a regular guy, but even in the Army, he could never get used to that kind of language, constant and numbing though it was. From white men in particular, it embarrassed him. Most black men knew how to curse lyrically and almost sweetly, and even some cracker boys, too, some of those non-com Georgia whites. But coming from most whites, it just didn't play well. And coming from white women, it was like fingernails on a blackboard. Maybe it was family training. Had it been old Winston Locke listening to her, Amy Goodman would have been left alone with her drink after the first words out of her mouth. But Larry endured her tirade, agreed with her, and watched her leave the party, her voluptuous hips moving easily underneath a floor-length cotton peasant skirt. For an instant, he imagined her naked, then turned his attention to the bar. The party was thinning out, and Larry moved to freshen his drink, to use the term he'd just learned. He was getting the hang of all this. Excuse me. As the fortunes of Kochville soared, so did Ed Koch's plummet. I think it would be an exaggeration to say that they caused his Waterloo. But I do think that they were, in a sense, symbolic of, richly symbolic, of a public and an electorate grown weary of the politics of abrasiveness. So possibly it's more accurate to call them a thorn in sort of a giant paw. But at a certain point, along about Christmas of that year, I think that Ed Koch himself sensed that his last hurrah was at hand. So in this next little snatch, I'd like to briefly glimpse him at that point. Christmas was the toughest time for older men with no families, be they Christian, Jewish, or neither. Maudlin commercials with candles and frosted windows suddenly seemed something to aspire to. At least, thought the mayor, the time was all planned out, without too many holes to fill. Christmas Day he would spend with friends, as always. The night before, on Christmas Eve, he would attend midnight mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral as a guest of Cardinal O'Connor. This would help considerably to restore the Irish vote, still in shards after his ill-considered remarks about the IRA. To solidify his position on the homeless issue, the mayor had also scheduled a pre-mass visit to the John Hughes House, a controversial new drop-in center in Lower Manhattan. What made it controversial was the neighborhood, Wall Street. The titans of the American economy, trading huge volumes of stock every day, would literally have to step over the homeless on their way to work. But taking a shot at the high rollers would be a cagey thing to do at this point in time, the mayor felt. For one thing, they were on the way out. The stock market crash in October of '87 had caught a lot of them with huge, unrealistic holdings, and many of them had gotten creamed. So since the mayor's coffers were already full, and since these schmucks didn't have much to give him anyway, it was time to jettison them and make some political capital in the process. If the masters of the universe find it disturbing to step over the poor on their way to work, said the mayor, then tough noogies. This he would repeat as the cameras were rolling, right around the time he was carving up a Christmas goose at the John Hughes House. Was it a goose? Whatever it was that the Goyim ate. The holidays were taken care of then, except for New Year's Eve. But there would be all kinds of invitations, all sorts of fabulous things to choose from, so that too would be taken care of until the stroke of midnight. Then, when people turned to kiss their mates or their dates, the mayor would have to go through some pathetic subterfuge. He would have to suddenly pretend to have to tie his shoelace or step out on the balcony. One time, he'd spent the critical 5 minutes in the bathroom, listening to the merrymaking. Oh, it wasn't so much that he cared himself what he was doing at the strike of midnight. He'd had his experience of the New Year months earlier on Yom Kippur, and it was far more profound than some WASP ritual of blowing a noisemaker or stealing a kiss. He just didn't want anyone staring at him as the clock chimed 12 and thinking, how sad, he's alone. The conflict, the tension, indeed the battle between Larry Locke and Ed Koch really is the spine of this story and leads to its denouement. But to find out what that is, you'll have to actually read the book, because the last snatch that I would like to read you is about a character who has no power at all, but who has always seemed to me to be the soul of Sleeping with the Mayor. And after I'm done with this, we'll field questions from the floor. She's a black homeless woman, and her name is Samantha Jones. Samantha Jones kept moving north, though she couldn't say why. After saying goodbye to Duke on Christmas night, she went from Chambers Street to Chinatown, where she spent a few nights in an alley warmed by the exhaust from Hop Key's restaurant. From there, she moved north to 34th Street, where she stayed a while in the vast, empty, out-of-business Altman's department store. When she was caught and thrown out of there, she moved to her present location on 58th Street, a vest pocket park besides the East River. Sometimes people were like birds, she thought, and moved by instinct. But what kind of a stupid bird goes north in the winter? She opened her bag and poked through it, being careful not to shred the satin lining. She loved this bag. It was some kind of carry-all from the 20s, hard tortoiseshell plastic handle, big woven pouch, a pattern of grape arbors on a mountainside. Utterly impractical for a homeless woman, she knew, but critical for her state of mind. She found the gloves she was looking for and put them on. The river was beautiful but cold. She would sit and watch it for a while before the night came on. The doctors had warned her that after her hysterectomy there might be fits of depression. Just the opposite was proving to be true. She felt rid of some weight, as if it wasn't her womb that had been reamed out, but her brain. She saw clearly now, without sadness, and beauty moved her more than ever. The sky was a hard, cold, deep blue. The lights on the Queensboro Bridge were on, and the East River caught them in specks and sparkles. It would be lovely sleeping here if it weren't so cold. She decided to try it anyway. She climbed the stone stairway to the street level and stood at the cul-de-sac. The gods were with her. One of the townhouses along the river had thrown out a section of carpet, and right next to it was a huge, discarded cardboard box from a TV set or some other appliance. A sporting goods store could not have provided better equipment. She hauled both items back down to her bench by the river, put the carpeting inside the cardboard, and climbed in. There was no wind, and her eyes closed quickly, and she drifted off. Some time later, perhaps an hour, she was awakened by voices. Some teenagers had arrived, drinking and carrying on. Samantha could make out their words, and to her relief, they did not seem to be thugs. From their inflection, given the neighborhood, she guessed they might be private school kids. Drunk, they were probably spoiled and nasty, but not violent. For this reason, she decided to remain in her box and wait it out. They stayed forever. One of them had been to Europe or was going to Europe and talked endlessly and dully about it. Samantha marveled at how someone so young could speak so casually of so great an adventure. Then they began to speculate about who was in the box. One of them thought it might be Jimmy Hoffa. Another joked that it was the father of one of their friends who always seemed to be losing his shirt in the stock market. One of the girls said she thought it was very sad and asked how anyone could ever wind up sleeping in a cardboard box. Nobody answered her. Then the mischievous nature of one of the boys got the better of him. "I wonder if any was alive in there," he said. He flicked the outside of the box with his finger, then scurried away. Samantha wondered what to do, whether to give a sign of life, which might lead to a confrontation, or just to lie there and hope it would stop. It didn't. The young people emboldened each other, and everyone took a turn at flicking or thumping the box, and the reverb inside went from irritating to loud to frightening. It began to feel like blows to the body. Finally, Samantha shouted, "Stop it!" And immediately they did. She could hear them mumbling and whispering, then shuffling away. As they left, she could hear one of the girls say, "God, it's a woman. That's really pathetic." Samantha tried to fall back asleep, but now she had to pee. It was freezing, and she hated to leave the box. She closed her eyes again, but her bladder was insistent, and her doctors had told her to obey this particular instinct. She squirmed out of the box and climbed into a large planter that contained a sort of dense oriental bush. She was obliged to invade it in a way that destroyed a few branches. She squatted and peed, trying hard not to wet her long johns, which were balled up around her ankles. A tugboat went by along the river. Samantha imagined it might be on its way to meet an ocean liner. She imagined a steamer trunk full of silk peignoirs. She imagined herself on deck, leaning over a rail, smoking a cigarette in a smart tweed suit, like the white movie stars of the 30s. She probably chose the tweed suit, she thought, because it was so goddamn cold. She very quickly snapped out of her fantasy, wiped herself with a piece of clean newspaper kept in her shirt pocket for just this purpose, and pulled up her pants. When she returned to the box, it was too cold to sleep. Once you've woken up on a cold night, you can pretty much forget it. She had to start moving. She climbed back up to street level and walked out of her enchanted little cul-de-sac to Sutton Place. She turned right and walked several blocks, but soon her feet began to act up. In the hospital, a doctor had told her she might have phlebitis, though that wasn't what they were treating her for, and he didn't care to get too deeply into it. Whatever it was, it made walking hard, and she decided to do something she knew she shouldn't do. She stuck out her hand to hail a cab. Not many black homeless women could get away with this, but Samantha was light-skinned and dressed and accessorized herself with enough flair to stop a taxi. Fortunately, the driver didn't get to smell her first. But it was the most dangerous kind of game because she didn't have the money to pay the fare. This often led to disaster. Once a cab driver had beaten her up. Another time, a driver had made her ride with him all night in the front seat and played with her sexually at his whim, even as unknowing passengers were in the back. Scrupulous drivers usually just turned her over to the police. That was almost the best-case scenario. Rarely was she simply forgiven and allowed to skip away. Despite all of this, the warm interior of a cab was too good to resist. It wouldn't be a checker with leather jump seats like in the old films because they were extinct, but it would be warm. She continued to hold out her hand, and finally a cab pulled over. The driver was a thin, dark man with intense eyes, a Pakistani or Indian. She got in, leaned up to the plastic shield that protected her from Mohammed Babar, license 34667, and said, until she could think of something more specific, north. And that's all I will read. Thank you for listening to me. And I guess, Howard, now it's time to open the floor for questions, if there are any.
Does anybody have any questions for John?
Yes.
How long did you spend in the homeless encampment in City Hall Park?
The question is, how long did I spend in the homeless encampment? About 2 months, really. And although in a sense, I was slumming because I knew that my self-imposed period of exile would end, and that within 2 months I would be back in my girlfriend's arms or under a hot shower or something like that. The homeless, of course, have no such knowledge, which makes their reality utterly, utterly different. But I think there are certain inescapable physical realities, some of which I came to understand. The most salient of which, actually, for me, was the sheer exhaustion of it. You know, you sleep with one eye open. There is no true rest. You can never close that door behind you, which is such a critical thing to do. And I think ultimately that sort of frays the nerves bare and creates a kind of manic depressive. I think, in a nutshell, that if people aren't crazy when they become homeless, shortly afterwards they do become that way, simply because it's such an assault on the senses. A long-winded answer to your question. Yes?
I regret, I've only read so far 267 pages.
Shame on
I've got
you.
100 to go.
Yeah.
May I just say I loved your book very much, and I will complete it and talk it up to many people. But
Thank you.
I noticed so far as it's gone, it's most of the book, there are no villains. I'm not being critical of that. You understand everybody. But now that you look back on the whole story of homelessness and of the protagonist and antagonist, are there any villains in this picture?
Well, you know, I think that if I'd written this book 10 years ago when these events actually happened, there would have been plenty of villains, because after all, I was living in this camp, the advocates had my ear, and to them, Ed Koch was the Mussolini of the 80s, and I think if I'd written the book then, I would have crucified him, quite literally, in print. However, you know, hopefully as one matures as an artist and as a person, you see pure villains and pure heroes nowhere. I mean, everyone in this room has, of course, their flaws and their saint-like qualities. I think that's also true of Ed Koch, and I mean, I don't think that Ed Koch is an unredeemed villain by any means. Nor do I feel that the guy lying in the gutter outside this door is a saint. So I think that you know, the not having heroes or villains is a product of letting the thing gestate and age. And I'm sort of glad I did. Yes?
During the period when you were living in the park, how did the homeless people react toward you? And in particular, did they know you were a journalist, and how did they react to that?
Well, they did know that I was a journalist because I was, even at the time, writing dispatches, sitting under a tree, typing dispatches to the Village Voice. I think many of them admired the craft of writing, even aspired to it. So in that sense, and of course, they perceived that I was doing them some good by getting the publicity that they were theoretically out there to get. I experienced almost no racism whatsoever, even though I was virtually the only white man there. I experienced no racism, an enormous amount of courtesy. I think that among people who have nothing to lose, there's a certain civility. So by and large, I felt extraordinarily comfortable. Additionally, because a lot of these guys were Vietnam vets, and the security in the camp was impregnable. I mean, everyone pulled a 2-hour watch duty every night, and didn't go to sleep until they knew that the next guy was firmly in place with a cup of coffee. So I wouldn't say that I slept like a baby, but as I said, it's a very manic depressive experience. There were moments lying on a soft tuft of grass in City Hall Park with the Woolworth building sort of twinkling above me, when everything was delightful, and 5 minutes later it all turned into a nightmare when a rat scurried past. And anyway, another long-winded answer. Yes?
I admired very much the feeling and the depictions of what people were going through, and your interspersing of some of the policy questions, not in a dry way, such as the Longwood Avenue house and other things. But I just wonder, I often had great difficulty in making a distinction between, if you like, art and the documenting. Now, maybe that distinction doesn't always have to be made, but it seems to me that we should at least be cautious about what is being described and what is being imagined. And for example, what you just read of Samantha that night, if she was alone, you were not there. I mean, if that experience was about the kids and what happened and so on, perhaps you spoke with her later, or, for example, in the excerpt that you read, in his mind's eye. I don't know that we know that. You may have spoken later. It just seems to me that we need to know more about this, and I wonder really how you did this, and because you were trying something that is very difficult, communicates to an audience who might not be interested otherwise if it were dry,
right.
Or a policy statement. But I had real concerns many, many times in the book about exactly what I was reading and just what you were doing. I say that respectfully.
Right. Well, it's a very good question, and in fact, the whole issue. Let me address first of all the woman in the very last section actually told me this. So I think that first-hand accounts are a very valid journalistic method, and I don't apologize for that at all. I have been taken to task, actually, by the New York Times Book Review for what Joyce Pernick called reconstructed dialogue. Now, this is a very hot issue among writers of nonfiction. Joe McGinnis, for example, in his book on the Kennedys, was widely criticized for creating dialogue. My answer to that tends to be slightly neurotic and defensive. If, for example, you were to go home tonight and see a television movie about Abe Lincoln and Mary Todd Lincoln, there would be nothing but reconstructed dialogue. But you wouldn't complain about it because they're dead. I think that, well, as you said, my primary mission was really to bring these characters to life. And so I was willing to do things that were questionable in order to achieve that end. I also come from a tradition of the theater, and dialogue is one of my tools. Stripped of it, I become, if not impotent, slightly less effective. So I think that in a case, for example, in the section I read about the exchange between Commissioner Henry Stern and Norman Siegel, none of that dialogue is verbatim because there was no tape recorder in the room. However, both parties took pains to give me their version of that exchange, and they coincided in substance. So therefore, I took the liberty of dramatizing the event in the only way that I knew how. So it's, you know, the issue I think will always be with us. I mean, apparently it's, if I may become for a moment neurotic and defensive again, apparently it's all right to say Smith demanded the money from Brown, but it's not all right to say Smith said, give me the money. I have a problem with that, especially when writers with presuming objectivity say Smith demanded the money from Brown, his face twisted into a grimace of agony or something. True, no dialogue has been created, but that's even more subjective than planting a simple sentence in somebody's mouth. So let me finish by not being neurotic and defensive and saying that I think it's a very good point. And you know, journalists who play fast and loose with the truth and put words in people's mouths are more often than not irresponsible. But I made the decision to take that chance in order to try to penetrate a public that I think has grown so weary and numb to this issue that I thought extreme measures had to be taken. So that is both my apology and my explanation. And thank you for the question. It's very good. Yes?
I was curious as to why you selected the Longwood Avenue building for your larger discussion of homelessness. And it was fascinating the way you talked about the building of the building and the people who built it and that sort of thing. But I just wondered if there was any nexus with the people in the park. I know at the end when Samantha goes there, but I mean, why was that selected? I know I knew some of the folks in the park, and I know that the only building that I was aware with that had anything to do with was the Matthew Lee building, those buildings in the Bronx.
Right.
What was the Longwood I mean, it was a beautiful framework for the whole thing, and the building and then the deterioration of the housing and how this all happens and things with neighborhoods. But why did you select that one?
Right. For the viewer who may be confused, a thread which runs throughout the book is a building in the Bronx constructed around the turn of the century that ultimately crumbles in a tragically symbolic way that many New York buildings have, and is renovated and winds up being the final resting place of the last character I read about, Samantha Jones. I chose that building because that's actually where she wound up. And upon looking into it further, I discovered, to my surprise and my delight, that it really was the first elevator building in the Bronx. And the more I spoke to people about the housing issue, which is incredibly complicated, the more it seemed to me that to simply write about the poor homeless would be simplistic, that there is hardware here. There are these empty buildings. Why? How did they get that? Why? Why isn't there anybody in them? That, so that without addressing that, and I made the choice of doing that by actually trying to make almost a flesh and blood character out of this building. I thought it would sort of lend a little, almost a little intellectual weight to what might have been not a sob story, but you know, a simpler tale, a more simplistic tale. Thank you.
John, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all for turning out. Bye-bye.
I really enjoyed it.